Our third speaker is Paddy Smyth, known to many of you. He's Foreign Policy Editor, Chief Leader Writer for the Irish Times. And Paddy served as both Washington and Brussels correspondent, and also as opinion editor and foreign editor. He is a member of the Irish Press Council and a founder of Let in the Light campaign, which was a campaign on freedom of information a number of years ago. And we've asked Paddy to reflect on the Yes Equality campaign and I suppose to give us his thoughts on such modern campaigns and even more recent ones and their challenges. Paddy, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Gráinne. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to contribute. I only hope that I'm not that I'm bringing something to this discussion. But I wanted to start by referring to Gráinne's reference to older men and the challenge of winning them over, and it reminded me of a story going back, I have to say, 30 years to one of the campaigns I was involved in, and that was the attempt to change the divorce, the ban on divorce. We were canvassing in a working class area of Dublin, Crumlin. I don't know if anybody knows the area, but there's a whole rake of streets known as the musical roads because they're named after different composers. Anyway, we knocked on a door and this elderly woman came to the door and her face lit up when she saw these two young canvassers. And she says, "You're doing a great job." She said, I'm absolutely delighted by what you're doing. This is a fantastic campaign that you're running. And good on you. So as I turned to leave, I said, "So we can count on your vote then?" "Ah, no," she said. She said, "After 30 years of misery from that fella in there, I'm not going to let him walk out the door." Now, it was interesting because actually it said something quite profound about what we had failed to do in preparing and managing the campaign for divorce at that time. We weren't properly addressing the issues that were at the backs of the minds of many people, particularly women, who did actually fear that there was no proposals in the package which would protect them from runaway husbands. We lost that referendum. We won it the next time by taking better account of such concerns. I was very struck in the aftermath of the British Brexit referendum by the analysis of the referendum by two writers. One, a woman called Dhruva Jaishankar, who worked for the Brookings Institution, and the other, Catherine Viner, editor of The Guardian. Both had very similar conclusions, that the referendum was the first one, they said, which was shaped decisively by what they called digital democracy, the power of the social media age being crucial. What was most interesting to me was the idea not of a massive social media presence, but the reality that in the course of the campaign, the culture of social media and of what they called digital democracy was to transform and was transforming politics and the nature of political discourse, offline as much as online. It's a process that has accentuated and been exaggerated, if you like, in the course of referendum process. It reminded me vividly of a discussion that I'd had at a dinner party about 8 months ago in the British Embassy. Charles Grant, who was a leading Remain campaigner, was over to brief us about their campaign. He was also notionally there to discuss lessons of Irish referendum, and he should have listened to us. Grant was told by several activists that during the Yes campaign on Lisbon and on marriage equality, campaigners had learnt profound lessons from our own campaigns on the first Nice referendum and the first Lisbon referendum, both of which produced no votes. Referendums in this country are not easy to win, but we've had a lot of them. Something that the British haven't, but they seem still to think that they know best. A quarter of Irish referendums have been lost by the government. 2 out of 9 European Union referendums. Critically, the effects noted by Jaishankar and Viner and associated by them with digital democracy have been a reality for some time here. And how much this is really a reflection of digital democracy? I'm not sure. But it is clear that the phenomena to which they adverted are very much so. They're very real and very important in changing the nature of campaigns. And they are definitely exacerbated and amplified by the digital revolution. My purpose is to bring, with broad brushstrokes, an illustration of how the Remain campaign failed, not least because they did not understand the new climate in which they were operating, particularly as it applied to referendums. And they certainly did not appreciate the difference that a referendum is from a normal election, and they took no account whatsoever of the valuable lessons that they could have learned from our own marriage referendum. Most crucially, from the start, there was a complete failure of the campaign to take into account the alienation of voters, young and old, from politics and politicians, a phenomenon that has spread throughout Europe in the course of the last 8 to 10 years, and which is reflected in every single country in Europe in the rise of populist movements of one kind or another, or of in our case, independent politics. Critical importance of the campaign is therefore, there is a critical importance that the campaign is led not by politicians, but by ordinary people, with some sprinkling of traditional leaders, whether they come from politics or business or sport or whatever, but not politicians, and not victims either, which was an important lesson of the marriage equality campaign. Political leaders introduce enormous burdens, hurdles to voters before they even come to consider the vote on a particular issue. Secondly, the critical importance of the campaign is not to fashion one based on facts. We live increasingly in a post-fact age in politics, and the contempt with which people like Gove treated experts is not just it's not just an incidental disgrace, but it's a feature of this age of campaigning, and perhaps it is something to do with the digital age. Success online is based on what somebody in America has called truthiness, and Trump has given his attacks on experts. He says always everyone is an expert online, a variation of the old cartoon adage that online nobody knows that you're a dog. Myths are amplified and unanswerable online because of what somebody has already said, what's called the echo chamber effect, the self-reinforcing nature of much online discussion. We hear only what we want to hear, what we choose to hear. There is a critical role. The critical role of the media is substantially undermined as a form of honest broker in discussions, though of course that applies to some media and not so much to others. And I just wanted to quote from an academic, Zeynep Tufekci, who I think is Turkish, and I hope he's not in jail at the moment. But anyway, he spoke of the rise of Trump. He says it's actually a symptom of the mass media's growing weakness, especially in controlling the limits of what is acceptable to say. I think that's very important, that the campaigns in the recent past have seen a decline of a gatekeeper role of the media. And in a digital democracy, Jaishankar says, a lie, or better yet, a half-lie, if told enough times, becomes a truth. And obviously the Brexit campaign saw a number of real whoppers, which seemed nevertheless to be established as truths. The classic one, I think, is the story about Cameron and the pig's head, which acquired an extraordinary currency. I won't go into it, but you can ask your neighbour if you don't know the story. they can tell you discreetly. But what was remarkable about that is the journalist who initiated the story was boasting afterwards that it wasn't her business to verify the story, simply to pass on what she'd heard. And that, unfortunately, is all too common in these days. Aaron Banks, who was the billionaire funder behind UKIP, talked of how they were transforming British politics into American politics. He said what they said early on, this was UKIP, was that facts don't matter, facts don't work, and that's it. The Remain campaign featured fact, 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 fact. The way to fight a campaign in which facts are really no longer central is, as has been said, through personal testimony, personal stories. And the slogan, "I'm voting yes, ask me why," was absolutely brilliant in that particular context. It's an issue which I will also return to in the context of the migration seminar, which we're having later this afternoon. I don't need to tell this audience, I'm sure, because they've internalized it all, that the success of the marriage equality referendum was directly attributable to the stories of mothers and fathers, of grandparents, of former President McAleese, of Alex White talking about his brother. But that isn't blindingly obvious, and it's something that the British could certainly have learned from. It would have provided a completely different type of campaign in Britain. They've pinned their flag to Cameron and to Corbyn, and it's hardly surprising that they didn't. They went down flying. The strategy didn't take any account of the fact that although Cameron might have been a relatively popular politician, he was also a deeply unpopular politician, something that doesn't apply to, if you like, anonymous people who become involved in campaigns. So the hurdle that I talked about in terms of politicians being part of a campaign wasn't there. There was also, and I've referred to this a bit in relation to my Crumlin story, a critical need to address unspoken fears, a lesson learned not least in the first divorce referendum, but also in the Nice one and Lisbon one. Failing in the UK to end concerns about immigration, particularly related to that. It wasn't good enough simply denying that there was a problem. The result would be a gradual acceptance that there was a problem by the electorate, and in fact, worse still, the gradual moving of politicians in the Remain campaign onto the same ground, into accepting the arguments being made by Leavers. It became completely impossible to challenge. The issue is crucial that when it comes to addressing individual issues, it's not a question of mobilizing and reinforcing the base, but of realizing and identifying the fears of soft supporters and the undecided, something which the campaign here did particularly well. Two very quick points then to finish. The youth, it's a fascinating comparison, because there was the mobilization of young people here was enormously successful. And the youth vote went up in the 18 to 24 group by 6% on the 2011 election. It went down in Britain. But paradoxically, young people in Britain appeared strongly to support the Remain campaign. They simply didn't believe there was any point in voting. They were switched off from the political system. The result is that getting the vote out is as important as persuading the voters. And young people can be mobilized if you launch grassroots campaign and you appeal to them. The Ring Your Granny campaign was brilliant because not only did it mobilize grannies, but it mobilized the young people who did the thing. I'll mention passing just the digital democracy also bleeds through into real politics with a distinct poisoning of the tone of debate, and that's something that we have to understand. And there was a problem in the course of the marriage equality referendum. But if we are to learn two critical lessons out of the failure of Brexit and the success of the marriage equality, firstly, we have to understand the need of the new political environment. We have to understand the alienation of people from the democratic process and fashion a campaign accordingly. And secondly, we must be prepared to engage with what happened here, which was a rigorous self-critique of both the means and the message of previous campaigns, and tailoring the campaign to that end. That was the great success of the marriage equality referendum, that it wasn't so concerned with being right as how the message would be transmitted. Thank you.